Hello, and welcome to Project and Technology Management. In this first presentation, we will be overviewing how the class will proceed each week and addressing the content of Chapter 1. My name is Professor Byron Newberry. I serve as the Dean of Engineering and Computer Science here at Oklahoma Christian University. I'm a mechanical engineer by discipline, but I also have worked as a project lead in industry for Shell Oil in the area of oil and gas offshore research. Each week, we will have multiple chapters that we are going to address in this class. I will put together a small recording, such as this one you're watching now, for each one of those chapters. Now, the recording is not intended, that's important to understand, it is not intended to cover everything in the chapter. It is intended to be a brief overview. And this overview will provide you guidance as to what is important in the chapter and what you should be looking for as you read the chapter. It will be critical, however, that you read each chapter. I will not cover everything that's in the chapter, but the content within the chapter will be necessary as we work on discussion forums and as you utilize the information on your class project. So let's begin with Chapter 1. Chapter 1, as entitled here, Project Management Concepts, is really an overview chapter. It is not a chapter in and of itself meant to introduce new content. It's meant to overview the big process of project management and to cover what the book in its entirety will cover. That's a great place to start because I want you to keep the big picture in mind as we go through this class. Project management can be very overwhelming to some because there's a lot of different aspects involved. However, we always must keep the big picture in mind as to what it is we're really trying to accomplish. And so as we proceed through this chapter, make strong mental notes of the big pieces involved in this process so that you can keep those straight each week as we add detail. A logical place to begin our discussion would be to ask the simple question, what is a project? The chapter will deal somewhat with that issue, but let me give an overview. First of all, projects are diverse in nature. When we are talking about a project in this class, it need not actually be necessarily directed at business. It could be a project that relates to a personal endeavor, perhaps something related to a church activity, a school activity, or to a corporate activity. All such projects will share many things in common. Now, certainly, corporate or industry projects may have greater detail to them. They may have more information involved in the process, but that doesn't mean other types of projects don't fit our model as well. What matters are a few details, as shown on this slide. First of all, a project needs to have a specific objective. In other words, we need to know what we're trying to accomplish. If we don't know what we're trying to accomplish, if there's no real goal to this set of activities, then it's really not a project. It's just a random collection of things that we're doing. Our techniques that we will develop through the course of this class depend upon knowing where we're trying to get to. So we need a specific objective. We also will require multiple tasks, many tasks in most cases, but multiple tasks in order to accomplish that end or that goal. If it's something that can be done in simply one or two steps, then it's really kind of a non-useful project for what we're trying to address. Now, all of these steps or tasks that are required to accomplish the goal are going to be interdependent, interrelated, and that is going to cause the complexity that we will have to face. You will also have costs associated with these tasks. Now, when I say costs, in this sense, I'm meaning cost in the most general way. That could be the cost in the form of material, cost in the form of dollars, cost in the form of time, cost in the form of human resources. All of those costs will come to bear on the project, and we will have to figure out how to utilize these resources in some optimal way. Finally, typically, you will have a schedule. If you have an unlimited amount of time to accomplish this goal, then again, the project is really not overly useful for what we're attempting to demonstrate in this class. It is the pressure of having to optimally accomplish the goal within available resources on a set schedule that requires a skilled project manager. I should say there is a last feature that is also important. As shown in the little cartoon diagram on this slide, is a customer or customers is typically involved in the project. In the vast majority of cases, you are not doing the project for yourself. You're doing it for someone else or perhaps a group of other individuals. And so their satisfaction is key to this overall process because you want repeat business. All of these features make project management something of a balancing act, something of a juggling exercise as shown in this cartoon. All of these features are in competition, and sometimes making one better will make another worse, and therefore we have to make compromises that are logical and intentional. This slide is designed to help you see the big picture of what the book is going to cover. We are going to spend our time primarily on chapters 2 through 12 of the textbook. Chapter 1, of course, is what we're addressing in this short recording, and it's an overview. And chapter 13 in the text will not be covered. It has to do with organizational structure within companies. It's an interesting chapter, but it's less to do with the direct involvement of a project manager, more to do with perhaps the leader of the project managers as to how they structure the company. So we will not address it. Now, I have used a diagram here of an arch to show you how these chapters fit together. Now, an arch is an interesting structure because it is extraordinarily strong. It has great structural features, but it depends upon every stone in the arch doing its job. If you pull a single stone, then the arch is incomplete. And with that incomplete piece, it weakens the entire structure and makes it useless. Project management is somewhat similar. Each thing we discuss will be critical to the process. You can be the best manager available within your company on 2 or 3 items, but if you're not good on all the items, then there's going to be a weakness in the project structure. You really can't just say, well, I'm going to pick activity A and ignore activity B. They're all important. So let's do an overview. This week, we will look at the things in blue. So we're after this discussion of chapter 1. We will also look at chapter 2, which is about identifying the needs in a project and understanding the point of the project. And then chapter 3 on developing a proposal for the project. These are those early phases. The second week of the class, we will look at defining the project in more formal detail and looking at creation of a schedule. These are the items in purple, chapters 4 and 5. Now, after week 2, we will actually have our midterm exam. I know that seems a little early, but the reason for doing that is that the amount of content in chapter 5 is a little bit larger. That's on scheduling. And so it makes for a nice break at that point to do the midterm. If we put the midterm after chapters 6 and 7 also, it would make the midterm exam cover a lot of material. So week 3, we will have our midterm exam. We will also, during week 3, kick off our class project. That way we can get it started relatively early to give you time to work on it. Week 4, we will return to our lecture presentations, And we will look at Chapter 6 on resource management and Chapter 7 on managing and tracking costs. Week 5, we will address 3 chapters, but these are a little bit smaller in size. We will be looking at managing risks, how we do risk assessment within a project, how we set up a system to identify when a risk is approaching, and how to know to take action preemptively. We will look at closing the project out when you come to the end of the project, perhaps prematurely if a project has to terminate early, but that's not the ideal. But every project has to be terminated eventually, and that closing out process is important. And then finally, we will look at some skills in Chapter 10 that project managers need to develop in order to be really successful. Week 6, we will finish up our content with Chapters 11 and 12. 11 addresses team skills and team dynamics and what you as a project manager should expect within your teams. And then Chapter 12 has to do with documentation and communication. Absolutely critical, because once the project is over and you've moved on, you're going to need the documentation from that project to refer back to when future projects come along that are related. Week 7, then, we will have our final exam in the class, and we will also have the submission of the projects. So this gives a brief overview of the entire course, how things fit together, and gives you a bit of a heads up as to how quickly you need to be reading. We will be covering material fairly quickly. Our textbook presents this image for the project lifecycle. You will see this multiple times throughout the text as we proceed through. It's a useful image. What it does is it divides the entire life of the project up into 4 big stages: identification of the need, development of a proposed solution, then execution or performance of the project, and then closing out of the project or termination of the project. Now, as you interpret this graph, you need to make sure that you're interpreting it correctly. The horizontal axis is time. The project proceeds over some duration. Could be a few weeks, could be a few months, could be a few years, depending upon the situation. The vertical axis is effort. Now note that effort is not the same as importance. It would make it seem like that the middle stage, the performance of the project, is what really matters. That's where the graph is high, that's where you need to put all your energy. That can be very misleading. The early stages, identification of the project needs and development of the proposed solution, are critical because they set the path for the entire project. So even though the graph is lower in those early regions, that does not mean those regions are less important. In fact, in many ways, they're more important. This is simply demonstrating effort, or if we could maybe use the term, the amount of energy that's put into that particular stage. Obviously, the middle stage, performance of the project, represents the lion's share of the energy or effort on the project, but not the lion's share of the importance. Now, I do want to emphasize that this is a relatively simplistic view of the project lifecycle. You can search around and find many other diagrams of the project lifecycle that show a bit more complexity. Many of them will show some recursion, the fact that as you go through the project, you may have to circle back and rethink your developed solution, maybe even reassess the needs, and that it's not quite this clean. And I agree with those diagrams. This diagram is a bit simplistic. However, it does do a great job to give us an overall map. So we're still going to use it. Just be aware of the fact that it doesn't always go quite this smoothly. Okay, as we wrap up our discussion of Chapter 1, let me again emphasize that I want you to read the chapter. The chapter is going to have a lot more detail in there than what we have discussed in this brief presentation, but hopefully the presentation has provided you a top-level overview and some guidance. Now, as I close out this short recording, let me emphasize the big picture one more time. What we are going to be doing is developing a project plan and then working the plan in order to control what happens through the duration of the project. Project control is important. It is critical. Projects don't just happen. They need to be intentionally executed. And so there's really four big steps involved in that. There's establishing the baseline plan. In other words, we understand the needs, we develop the proposed solution, we put together projected schedules, projected resource utilization charts, and we have a plan. We then move into the second phase where we start doing things. We begin executing the project, but it's important that we monitor progress in that stage of the project. In other words, as we do things, is the project proceeding with the plan? Was our plan correct? Are we following along in the way that we expected, or are things going very differently? Did we miss the plan? Once we have the plan and the reality of what progress is really happening, we move to the third phase. And that's where we measure progress and compare it to the plan to see where there's discrepancies. You cannot do this third stage without having both the defined baseline plan and data on progress. Both are going to be critical, and we're going to emphasize that many times as we proceed through the book. One is not sufficient. Once you've compared the two and you looked for where there's differences, we get to the fourth phase, where we take corrective action if needed. Now, the nature of the corrective action can be multifaceted. Perhaps the progress is lacking and we need to do something to improve progress on the project or improve the way the project is proceeding to better match the baseline plan. That's one option. Or perhaps the baseline plan is flawed. Perhaps our early understanding of how this is going to proceed, how resources will be utilized, how the schedule will proceed was inaccurate. And in that case, we might actually have to adjust the plan. Now, you want to be careful doing that because the temptation is just make the plan meet reality and then you can pat yourself on the back and say, well, look, it's doing what I said. Not really. You're just adjusting the plan to match reality. But once in a while, plans are flawed and you have to correct them. So this is something that we're going to be looking at as we proceed through the book, how to put these 4 steps into overall action. So in other words, baseline plan, monitoring progress, comparison, and then corrective action. There's a famous quote by Benjamin Franklin that I think serves well to wrap up what this chapter is about. His statement was, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. Projects will not guide themselves. That's what this is all about. The project manager needs to keep a hand on the reins, so to speak, in order to guide the project to a successful completion so that the customer will be satisfied.